It is my great pleasure to introduce the second panel of today, entitled Transnational Connections, Localizing the Global, Mobilizing Through Media. This panel will be chaired by Professor Susan Gall, who is the May and Sydney G. Metzl Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology, Linguistics, and of the Social Sciences in the College at the University of Chicago. Professor Gall has published extensively on many topics relevant to today's discussions, among others, language ideology, semiotics of public communication, and her work also focuses on the construction of gender and discourses of reproduction. Professor Gall told me to diminish her extensive publication record into one book, so I apologize for that, but I want to highlight her latest, which was co-written with Judith Irvine, titled Signs of Difference, Language and Ideology in Social Life, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, and recipient of the 2021 Edward Sapir Prize from the Society of Linguistic Anthropology. Professor Gall, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And if you cannot hear me, please tell me, or if it's whistling or something. Okay, well, thank you very much, Misha. And we already know the title of the session, Transnational Connections, Localizing the Global, Mobilizing Through Media. And because our talks are a little longer than initially planned, and I think you should be listening to our speakers rather than about them by me, I'm going to make short shrift of introduction. Our first speaker is Rodrigo Borba from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He teaches in the Department of Anglo-Germanic Letters at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and in the Applied Linguistics Interdisciplinary Graduate Program there. And the title of, and has published lots and lots of things, which I think we're going to circulate people's short CVs. The paper title is Circulating Globally, Adapting Locally, the Linguistic Infrastructure of Anti-Gender Politics. Please join me in welcoming Rodrigo.
Thank you, Sue, for the lovely introduction. Thanks also to Misha and Roy for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be here for, especially at this moment in Brazil, because we are facing an election. So it's quite interesting to be here at this moment. So in my talk, I'll tap into some of the things that Agnieszka, Graf, and Camille already mentioned about the language of anti-genderism. Yes, yet as a linguist and as a social linguist, I still feel that the linguistic and the discursive dimension of anti-genderism are still understudied. And my talk builds on a project that I'm developing with a colleague at the University of Turin, Angela Zottola, in which we are gathering large corpora of anti-gender texts in different languages and from different countries, with a view to comparing the similar patterns and also differences in the way anti-genderists act, both transnationally and globally. So despite these very important local particularities, transnational anti-gender campaigns are strikingly similar on several levels. First, they are loosely linked by what is called gender ideology, and in certain places, gender theory, genderism, the gender lobby, or the LGBT lobby, or the trans lobby. Second, they demonstrate that the appeal of the gender ideology formula rests precisely on its semantic elasticity. And lastly, they rely on apocalyptic discourses and fear-mongering. Anti-genderists' boisterous public demonstrations provide fertile ground for conspiracy narratives about the destruction of the natural order of things, namely patriarchy, heterosexuality, and the traditional family. This talk focuses specifically on the discursive infrastructure of anti-gender, of what Angela and I call anti-gender conspiracy narratives, and their circulation through national borders and across different languages. To do so, Angela Zottola and I analyzed two corpora of far-right media from Brazil and the US, grounded on corpus-based critical discourse analysis. The study unpacks the discursive patterns of expressions relating to gender ideology in the corpora to investigate the semantic realms which give it meaning. Comparing data sets from these two countries allows us to scrutinize how anti-gender conspiracist expressive forms cross geographical and linguistic boundaries and adapt to local specifics along the way. So Byford suggests that conspiracy theories, or CTs, are often materialized as narratives which rely on three elements: the conspirators, those who plot against an unsuspecting group of people, the plan, the conspirators' actions, and lastly, the endeavor to maintain secrecy, the objective of the conspiracy, which must be laid bare by individuals who keep watch on the conspirators. For Byford, conspiracy theorists typically use metaphors from the semantic realms of theater and puppeteering that portray their opponents as invisibly pulling the strings of the world. Another common feature of these narratives is the use of the rhetoric of scientific scrutiny, of scientific inquiry. Conspirational explanations of the world replace facts with alternative ones that best fits their view of the world. Looking at how gender ideology is discursively produced in anti-gender media provides fruitful avenues for unpacking: one, the infrastructure of its conspirational rhetoric; two, its circulation through transnational borders; and three, its local adaptation within national contexts. So in terms of methodology, I won't bother you with the very tiny details of corpus linguistics methods, but I'll just give you an overview of what we did. So Angela Zottola and I collected, for this paper, we collected 2 corpora of news articles from Brazilian and US far-right outlets. The data set covers a time span of 3.5 years, from January 2017 to June 2020. The search phrases gender ideology and ideologia de gênero were used to select the newspaper articles. The corpora were analyzed using CQP Web, a corpus linguistic software, and subsequently compared. A collocation analysis of the terms ideologia, ideology, gender, and gênero helped us identify statistically relevant co-occurrences. So collocation in corpus linguistics refer to lists of words that frequently co-occur with the search term. We analyzed the top 15 most significant collocates, which were qualitatively investigated via concordance analysis. So in corpus linguistics, concordance is the broader context where the search phrase appears. So we then investigated the occurrences of phrases gender ideology and ideologia de gênero, since their collocation was, of course, statistically significant in both corpora. It's hot now. I wanted to show off my Lulu sticker. So on to the analysis. The collocation analysis of the top 15 most significant collocates of the 4 key terms reviews how the news outlets evaluate gender ideology through adjectives and nouns which carry negative and effectively loaded connotations, as this table shows. So terms such as harms, Marxist, communism, leftist, maneuvers, infamous, they all collocate very frequently with the search terms. In the US corpus specifically, the strongest collocate of ideology is harm. The discourse of danger is furthered by the use of adjectives such as abusive and harmful, and by assessments of gender as a violation of children's right to bodily privacy and safety, as one of the articles from the American Thinker says. Can you move to the next slide? Cool. We further investigated the search terms via dispersion analysis, and one of the discursive patterns also confirmed by this type of analysis is the association of gender ideology with the political left. So the table shows how that in texts where the term gender ideology appears, the terms Marxism, communism, and left also appear. In the Brazilian corpus, an interesting difference is that environmentalism also collocates very frequently with gender ideology, which seems to suggest that anti-genderists are also anti-environmental issues, which is particularly preoccupying for Brazilian and the Amazon. So the dispersion analysis suggests that gender ideology is frequently collocated with other seemingly unrelated themes. In this case, gender ideology, communism, Marxism, and leftist systematically overlap in the corpus. We refer to this phenomenon as a thematic bundle, namely a merging of distinct semantic fields that emerges when collocates and node belong to apparently unrelated semantic realms. Such thematic bundles are frequent in both corpora, but they differ slightly from the US and Brazil. This cluster suggests that anti-genderism may be viewed as a proxy for anti-leftism, and in the case of Brazil, anti-environmentalism. Similar findings emerge from the concordance analysis of ideologia in the Brazilian corpus. The most significant collocate for this term is famigerada, or infamous. This is a straightforward attempt at manipulating the reader to view gender and also ideology negatively. And as can be seen in this example, which presents ideologia de gênero as a method of indoctrination and censorship, according to this author, they say. In this sense, there are countless inventions of four democratic Marxists in the quest to indoctrinate, censor, and impose a new worldview. Obviously, at first, they present a noble objective for an even nobler cause, founded on unquestionable and praiseworthy virtues. However, this disguise used to prevent questioning the absurdities they present. There are countless examples. The infamous gender ideology is only one of them. So portraying gender as the instrument of a totalitarian project contributes to the self-sealing quality of the anti-gender conspiracy narrative. This is also accomplished by a rhetorical strategy we call discourse reversal, whereby feminist and queer activism is turned against the people they should protect. In other words, the emancipatory intent of feminist and queer views is framed as malevolent to women and LGBTQ plus individuals themselves. This reversal rhetorical strategy produces a categorical cleavage. Feminist and queer conspirators, meaning activists, academics, and elite, versus everyday women, lesbian, and gay men, as shown in this example. To have an idea of the seriousness of the situation, this is all in Portuguese, I just translated them. To have an idea of the seriousness of the situation, the suicide rate among transsexuals is 40%. We are talking here about an epidemic that is taking human lives and for which treatment is prohibited, so that these people can be used as mass of maneuver, an object of manipulation, for the imposition of a nefarious and genocidal ideology. All my criticism of gender ideology and differentiated treatments for homosexuals have nothing to do with bigotry, hatred, and homophobia. On the contrary, it is just desperation to consciously watch lives being destroyed or mowed down in the name of this social engineering to which we are being subjected. This example references suicide rates among trans people, which are depicted as a consequence of the spread of gender ideology, a nefarious and genocidal form of social engineering. The reversal rhetoric also distances anti-genderists from accusation of bigotry and hatred. This author writes in defense of trans people about whom he is desperately worried, but against feminist and queer activists who are portrayed as malicious conspirators. The concordances of gender ideology in the US corpus demonstrate a strong negative evaluation of the phrase through adjectives such as pernicious and destructive, radical, dubious, dangerous, ridiculous, extreme, and wacky. The manipulatory character of gender ideology is also reinforced by the verbal patterns with the phrase as subject occurring in the concordances. Examples include impose, foist, harms, and force. The definitions of gender ideology reinforce this manipulative discourse. Examples suggest that the concept of gender is, and I quote, just an ideology. Another example, not appropriate for Catholic schools. another example, being force-fed to children built on feminism, profoundly anti-scientific. These examples point to the use of reversal rhetoric in the US corpus as well, whereby feminism is viewed as inherently deleterious, especially for the people it should protect. One last example worth mentioning is the personification of gender ideology as an enemy, fostering the conspiracist narrative's three-parted structure, an agent, a plan, and secrecy, as this example illustrates from the National Review. As the Goliath of gender ideology runs amok, undermining American political, legal, cultural, education, and journalistic institution, we at National Review stand strong with sling and stone. This evil. The following table shows the top 15 collocates of the phrase ideologia de gênero analyzed in the Brazilian corpus. While some of the results overlap with those presented earlier in the US corpus, interesting patterns can be highlighted as well. The strongest collocate is from a quote by the President Bolsonaro, who is luckily going to leave the country this Sunday, in his inauguration speech, a call to arms to fight gender ideology. So the journalist refers to the inauguration speech. President Jair Messias Bolsonaro reaffirmed his commitment to Brazil during a speech at the National Congress this Tuesday, January the 1st. Quote, "We will unite our people, value the family, respect religions and our Judeo-Christian tradition. We will fight gender ideology, preserving our values. Brazil will again be a country free from ideological bonds," said Bolsonaro during the inauguration. This example illustrates two important discursive patterns in the Brazilian corpus. First, it reinforces anti-genderist ideas from powerful people and institutions, in this case, the country's president, which makes the conspiracy narrative believable and institutionally supported. Second, far-right extremist and fundamentalist views of how the world should be are presented as non-ideological by saying that the country will be free of ideological bonds once it fights gender ideology. So gender ideology is thus a wide-ranging category of denunciation, as both Sônia Correia and Susan Gall have called it, used to lambaste progressive groups and institutions who the anti-genderists portray as plotting to destroy children's innocence, the nuclear family's sanctity, and consequently, the nation's moral integrity. In other words, in our data, anti-genderism emerges as a conspiracy narrative which portrays feminists, LGBTQ+ communities, and the political left as secretly plotting against the status quo. This narrative is based on supposedly scientific truth, despite its links to the far right and religious institutions, while feminism and environmentalism are discredited as ideologies that aim to indoctrinate the collective mind. Recent scholarship suggests that gender ideology works as a discourse, a political strategy of far-right populism, and a transnational phenomenon with harmful and national effects. Probing two corpora of far-right media from the US and Brazil provides a window into the ways the three macro-sociological dimensions described by Paternotte and Coir are entwined in anti-genderist situated language use. The deployment of a conspiracist narrative structure allows anti-gender zealots to rewrite progressive agendas about human rights, reproductive health policies, and anti-discrimination in school curricula as a plot of malicious groups who aim to destroy the pillars of the nation. Despite its apocalyptic portrayal of feminism and queer activism, the anti-gender conspiracy narrative gains credence through four main strategies. One, disingenuous use of scientific discourse to discredit feminism and other academic fields as ideological while taking on a patina of neutrality. Two, highly negative adjectival characterization of any gender-related ideal via a discourse of manipulation. Three, Reversal rhetorical moves whereby gender equality is reversed as bad to those it intends to protect. And 4, the use of well-established rights and anti-discrimination vocabulary to advance exclusion and discrimination. The transnational character of this register is attested by this strategy's presence in both corpora. Framing feminist and queer demands in a narrative triad consisting of agents, plans, which in this case refer to the sexualization of children, the destruction of heterosexual family and others, and secrecy aids anti-genderists to depict themselves as well-intentioned citizens wishing to warn the unsuspecting population about this plot. This is done through broad and vague nominalizations, which make it difficult to identify the conspirators. In our data, gender ideology functions as a central element of the anti-gender conspiracy narrative. This narrative is sustained by anti-scientific discourse, the creation of thematic bundles of otherwise unrelated actors and views, and reversal rhetorical moves. In this way, anti-gender supporters put forward a series of legitimation strategies that allow people to believe and endorse their ideas. These similarities enable anti-gender beliefs to circulate through transnational borders, which in turn makes them stronger. At the same time, the affective bond that seduces people into believing in anti-gender conspiracies is only possible because of the local adaptation of the references, events, and issues associated with this discussion within national contexts. So we believe that looking at how anti-gender zealots use language and rewrite feminist and queer concepts may prove useful in devising ways to confront this conspiracy narrative self-sealing quality. Thank you. Sorry if I exceeded my time.
Thank you, Rodrigo. We will have discussion later. Our second speaker today, actually in this session, is Marianne Case, who is a professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School. And she... I don't think I'm the next speaker. Yes, I think you are, because we're waiting for the, right? Isn't that right? Marianne goes for next, or would you like to do Patrick next? Yes, I think you should go next. Is that sure?
Fine with me. I just didn't want to keep.
No, you see, we have, just to explain to everybody, we have one participant who was supposed to go first, Patrick Awondo, who could not come, and he could not be present on Zoom either. So he sent us a video. And so we're trying to deal with the video, and that's why we have moved his talk.
Can I just interrupt for a moment and say, if I am next, 90% of my talk is images. What the images say is much more interesting than what I say. So if those people at this side of the room cannot see it while Susan is introducing me, let me invite you to please go and look at my images and tell me about them more than I can tell you about them.
So I'm going to go back to introducing you. Okay. So Marianne Case, who is a professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School and also on the board of the Center for Study of Gender and Sexuality. She has written much on the Vatican and its relationship to gender ideology. And she asked me to say specifically, an official observer at the integration of women in the Virginia Military Institute, which is relevant to the talk that she's about to give. And the name of the talk is Masculinities in and Around the Ukraine Conflict. So please join me in welcoming Marianne and her video.
Those of you who know me also know that I don't usually do PowerPoint. This is my third ever PowerPoint and it's a very complicated one. So please bear with me. It's got multiple ingrained videos. What I usually do instead is old-fashioned visual aids. So I am going to be talking about Ukraine. I am wearing Alamuti and the sunflowers, and I've got this watch that I've owned forever. Swatches is usually how I do my visual aids, but it's got the lone gunfighter with the Ukrainian flag and lots of rainbows, and I have no idea whether this was in the designer's mind because the watch has existed for a while. I am going to take a big risk and talk about something I know very little about, which is masculinities in Ukraine. I do not speak Russian. I certainly don't speak Ukrainian. This is all new to me, which is why I do want you to see the videos, because a lot of you are going to have more to say about them than I do. I come to this, however, with some background, which is that I've been writing since the beginning of my career about gender discrimination is distinct from sex discrimination. That is to say, discrimination in favor of or against qualities coded masculine or feminine, sometimes irrespective of and sometimes inflected by whether the people displaying them are masculine or are male or female. So this is one of the things I wrote about in the Virginia Military Institute context, a famous constitutional law case about military masculinities, military femininities. And I've also looked at this in the context of Abu Ghraib and torture. And I've been vamping until have you been able to say, okay. So, and the methodology I'm using here, I actually bring from not my theology studies at the University of Munich, but my art history studies at the University of Munich. And those of you who know about German education in the mid-20th century, you start as you declare your major freshman year, and you don't do a lecture course. You're an art historian, you come into a seminar, they hand you an object and they say, come back and report on this object for us. So I am gonna start with an object. The object is a video done by Zelensky's troop, Kvartal 95, in 2014. And if you don't know about Zelensky's troop, it's roughly Saturday Night Live and I will tell you more about the troop as we go on. But what I've got here, I'm going to be playing the video, and one of the reasons I'm going a little over time is because I can't speed up the videos. I wish I could. It's in Ukrainian. Again, I don't speak Ukrainian. There are no subtitles, even in Ukrainian or Russian. This is the best that multiple levels of translation have been able to produce. I am guessing that we are talking about these names are Ukrainian politicians, but that's just my guess. I don't really know from Ukrainian politicians. Actually, okay. So what it is a narrow, what I want this is this one. Okay, so what this is a very close imitation. This is 2014, and I'll put that in context. I mean, you already know Euromaidan, Conchita Wurst wins Eurovision.
I know, I'm trying to, it's not coming through on Zoom, and I'm not sure, so while she's talking.
Okay, so it is narrowly a parody of these folks from 2011, the same costumes, the same dance moves. In 2013, however, this boy band also does another video called Crazy Laws. And I'm not sure, but some of the commentators have suggested that the Crazy Laws are the Russian anti-gay laws. And this is the original text and the official. This is not unlike what I'm talking about, a weird translation. They're writing in English, and English is not their native language. So with that background, and I invite you to look at the video. You'll see in the video a magician or someone conjuring dumplings into his mouth. That is a version from a Gogol short story about Christmas that is what became a Soviet film. I'll just play the video, and I will say that the video with the dubbing of all the single ladies, which I think is totally off point. Oh, Zelensky is the guy in the front.
Будьмо гей, по першій, по другій, по третій, будьмо гей, сам ти гей, за Юлю, на долю, за Ляшка, ось моя булава, браття мої, завтра йдемо танцювати проти москалів, затанцюємо, нова сила у нас є, ще не вмерла Україна, поки крепко є. Сало, цибуля, хрін, сивуха, браха, п'ю, я п'ю, шоу. Коханці, засланці, всі глянці, тьфу на них, артисти, стилісти, геть з міста, ще дай помади, гей паради, а в раді, всі такі, я хочу, не можу, за сало. Ну давай, ось моя булава, браття мої, завтра йдемо танцювати проти москалів, затанцюємо, пак сила у нас є, ще не вмерла Україна, поки сало є. Сало, цибуля, хрін, сивуха, браха, п'ю, я п'ю,
No. I'm gonna have to ask you to do the moving because I can't. Okay. So what is referenced here is a bunch of traditional Ukrainian things, including this traditional Ukrainian male dance, which I show you a still shot of. But it also references the Cossacks. And again, it's at the time of Euromaidan. There is a famous guy who is stripped naked by the police. He self-identifies as a Cossack. He later gets elected to the Ukrainian parliament. And then he says everybody in the Ukrainian parliament is gay. I don't know from exactly what perspective he says that, but he says that. So what I want to take this video very seriously. And what I want to do is suggest that a line from actually the book of Matthew explains this. There's a line in the book of Matthew that says, every scribe who becomes a disciple is someone who can take out of his storehouse the new as well as the old. So what I take this video to be saying is we can turn to Europe without losing anything important about our heritage. We've still got our borscht and our Cossacks and not only that, but the worst thing you can say about us, I'll see you and I'll raise you, I'll embrace it. Let's be gay. Yes, let's be gay. And as gay Cossacks with our borscht, we can take you. Russians. We can take you in a dance competition or any other competition of your choice. And so now I can't do it because the auto translate is interfering with the advanced function. Okay, so as I mentioned, what is the context for this? It's not only Euromaidan and the Cossacks being, the self-identified Cossacks being stripped, but it's the year Conchita Wurst wins the Eurovision contest, and this drives the Russians nuts, even before it's tied to the Ukrainians turning west from them. It is also the year that the World Congress of Families is scheduled to be held in Moscow, but because of fears about the effect of the invasion of Crimea on possible sanctions against participants, they sort of said, no, we're moving it somewhere else, and then probably didn't move it somewhere else, probably held it on the sly also in Moscow. But I'm taking it, this is a crowd who knows what the World Congress of Families is. Camille, I think, referenced it, for example. So when, at the time of Euromaidan, as you see, Russian propaganda used Poroshenko, who took over and said basically, he's a homosexual, he's a cross-dresser, he's not a man, as compared with Vladimir Putin. And the familiar images of Putin being masculine, I've centered around Putin playing the not particularly masculine song Blueberry Hill to a crowd of international celebrities. You can find the video of him singing and playing. By contrast, Zelensky, right? When he plays the piano, he plays it with his penis. Now, is that more or less manly than Putin? But he's also, he wins Dancing with the Stars in a hot pink outfit. His, the series that made him eligible for election as president, called Servant of the People, he shows up as this schlubby kind of guy who's a history professor who gets catapulted to success. And, here he is in a wife beater, but he's not someone capable of beating his wife, let me put it that way, or anyone. And in season 2, there is a famous cross-dressing episode where Zelensky is president and his corrupt prime minister, whose corruption has been exposed because his corrupt alias was Milady, and it turned out that they uncovered that it was he because he had played Milady de Winter in a production of The Three Musketeers in an all-male school environment. So he calls himself Milady. So here's my second clip, if I can manage to play it. Oh, hang on. Can I go back? Yeah. So this is, the prime minister corrupt is now turned to the good side, and with Zelensky is trying to get evidence on the oligarchs. They are being pursued by a bunch of beefy oligarch goons in black cars. They have cross-dressed to escape them. They are in a hot pink van of a cake company that they have stolen.
Был бы пистолет, я бы от них отстреливал. А так что прикажете? Тортиками в них бросать?
I think you get the idea. And so again, one of the contrasts is Zelensky-Putin. Another contrast is Zelensky-Trump. They both got to their presidency from having been on TV shows. The difference is Trump's, as we now know, was hyper-produced and gave an image of him as successful when he wasn't. Zelensky produced his own show. Zelensky was an extremely successful entrepreneur in the entertainment business before he became president. But there's still this notion that Zelensky is not manly and Trump is manly, and manliness is what counts. But Trump's manliness is all a production, right? There's this famous clip of Trump before being president tackling someone in a Worldwide Wrestling, and everybody knows Worldwide Wrestling is fake. And every person Trump has ever physically assaulted has been paid to take the fall. And this is something important to know about Trump. Now, Zelensky also uses in his presidential life things that he previously used in his entertainment life. For example, there's a very close connection between the kinds of speeches Zelensky gave as president after the war began and the ones his character gave in Servant of the People. And here we see, the beginning of the transformation. I mean, even if you think masculinity is what counts, suddenly Zelensky, who has gone beefy and bearded and olive drab, contrasts favorably, even on a masculinity, let alone on a success component, with Putin, who is in this sissified room at cowardly distance from his advisors. Nevertheless, both of them have become sex symbols. If they're, I Want a Man Like Putin and other similar songs are big hits. You can see Putin's image on the bikinis and Rip It for Putin. Zelensky's sex symbol only postdates his. So I'm going to play yet another set of ads. These were posted in 2021, and contrasting the Russian ads with the American Army ads. Ted Cruz posted, retweeted this favorably, and has now taken down that favorable retweet for reasons the Ukraine war makes obvious. But let me, can I play these?
Новой жизни. Что ты знаешь о себе? На что ты способен? Вопросы могут остаться без ответов, но разве ты способен знать себя? Познать границы своих возможностей? К черту границы, а без боя нет победы. Но на самом деле, главный враг — это задача выследить врага, догнать его.
I think you get the idea. The language that a Russian speaker said, it's, what do you know about yourself? What are you capable of? Do you want these questions to remain unanswered? There is no victory without a battle, and you need to overcome yourself and others. Here's the U.S. Army ad.
This is the story of a soldier who operates your nation's Patriot missile defense systems. It begins in California, with a little girl raised by two moms. Although I had a fairly typical childhood, took ballet, played violin, I also marched for equality. I like to think I've been defending freedom from an early age. When I was 6 years old, one of my moms had an accident that left her paralyzed. Doctors said she might never walk again. But she tapped into my family's pride to get back on her feet, eventually standing at the altar to marry my other mom. With such powerful role models, I finished high school at the top of my class, and then attended UC Davis, where I joined a sorority full of other strong women. But as graduation approached, I began feeling like I'd been handed so much in life, a sorority girl stereotype. Sure, I'd spent my life around inspiring women, but what had I really achieved on my own? One of my sorority sisters was studying abroad in Italy. Another was climbing Mount Everest. I needed my own adventures, my own challenge. And after meeting with an Army recruiter, I found it. A way to prove my inner strength and maybe shatter some stereotypes along the way. I'm U.S. Army Corporal Emma Malone Lord, and I answered my calling.
Okay. So the post's responses were of two varieties. Here's the collection of the "you must be kidding me," this is, obviously, so the overarching image is choose your fighter, right? So here are the people who clearly chose the Russian and think the US are in huge trouble. I'll leave you a few seconds to read these and then move on to, here are the people who think the reverse. I'm obviously on the side of this panel, and this reminds me again of both the work I have done on the integration of women at VMI and the comparison with the so-called Virginia Women in Leadership that didn't even get respect from Ruth Bader Ginsburg because it treated people nicely. And I observed both of these and found that the Virginia Women in Leadership were doing a lot better than the men of VMI or even the men and women of VMI. I subsequently wrote about gender and sexualized torture at Abu Ghraib. And again, the idea was harsh treatment is what the Russians and the Republicans think is the only thing that produces results, whereas anybody who knows anything about interrogation knows that being nice to people, that is to say, being feminine, risking looking weak, not harsh, is what actually produces results. So this, again, I may not know anything about Ukraine, but I recognize things when I see it. And I see them in the US riffing off of both the Ukraine conflict and particularly the admiration for Putin and Russia. So here's 3 images of Josh Hawley that I think might make my point rather than Hawley's. The cover for his book, which he still plans to bring out, him fist bumping the January 6th people, and his famously running away on January 6th, later in the day, shortly after the fist bump, running away from the very people he was saluting. And you know, the thing is that they know they're weak, right? they're not acknowledging they're strong. They're trying to save their masculinity by any means necessary. So I'm going to finish up very soon. These are some images. So it's not just masculinity that has its problems, but femininity too. So when Olga Zelenska was photographed in Vogue, there are some people said she shouldn't have been photographed in Vogue at all, or in fancy dress, fancy designer clothes. But what interests me is she was criticized for looking unfeminine, and the response of Ukrainian women is to post these "sit like a girl" hashtags. It's not that the Ukrainian have had no difficulty at all integrating masculinity and femininity in their army. This is from 2021, and it created a huge backlash in Ukraine. But you now are seeing all of these images of both male and female ballet dancers now becoming soldiers. You are seeing images of, for example, the Ukrainian sumo wrestling team, which is gender integrated and whose coach is a woman. You're seeing lots of images of powerful Ukrainian women, including, I've just taken one example, the Russian war crimes investigator. And I'm going to end with just playing this silently playing. Well, no, I guess I'm not silently playing. Let me turn down the volume. So this song, I gather, about being a Ukrainian girl, and it's one of many montages of Ukrainian women being soldiers, but in ways that include flowers, and there's another that includes lots of cats and animals and cute things. There's another version of this video that's pre-war, that's all the Ukrainian girls in traditional dress and garlands and things, and there's another version of this with the military to the Ukrainian national anthem. But I wanted to end with what it means to be a Ukrainian girl. I'll stop it.
Everyone stay seated where you are, because our third presentation today is actually Patrick Awando, from the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, who is in France right now and cannot be present even on Zoom. So he has sent a video for us to watch. He is a lecturer at the University of Yaoundé and a senior research fellow at the University College London. And his work is on African migrants, especially homosexuals who migrate from Cameroon to France to try to escape rising homophobia. And his talk today, we've got the video, is entitled Campaigning Against Gender and the Emergence of the New Sexual Patriots in Central Africa. So.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Roy, thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this. It's a very important conversation, especially for us from Africa. There is a huge wave of anti-gender campaigning, even if it is not conceptualized openly as anti-gender the way it is elsewhere in the world. So I am really thankful for this invitation and for these opportunities to discuss that. Well, I'm gonna give some few general view on anti-gender, because it's important to have this global view in order to well situate African controversies and experiences among these complex and diverse anti-genderism currently undergoing globally. So let me start by this very even if I guess you are all aware of what anti-gender is, it's important to start from there and then shift to the controversies in Africa before giving a point on how this works in some part of the continent, especially in Western Central Africa, where I work. So, as you know, the works that deal with the contestations against gender ideology, gender theory, or gender, were first interested in the religious and political mobilizations against liberalization of rights related to sexuality, the body, gender, and the family in Europe and Latin America and the US, led by Catholic and evangelical churches, before taking an interest broader conservative mobilization, following the example of what someone also cited here, the Manif pour tous in France. These studies have examined the functioning of this mobilization through the analysis of the profile of the actors who carry them, their discourses, their repertoire of action, their network strategies, and so on. So in describing anti-gender for its different objective, it appears like a rhetorical counter strategies that seeks to refute at least five reality, if I follow Elizabeth Corridor's definition. The first is to refute claim about the hierarchical construction of racial, gendered, and heterosexual order. The second is to essentialize and delegitimize feminist and queer theories of gender. Third, to counteract global and local gender mainstreaming thought. Fourth, to counteract gender equality policies and the public emergence of LGBTQI people. And finally, to reassert a heteropatriarchal conception of sex, gender, and sexuality. So what about African controversy on this? It is interesting to start from this exhaustive definition in order to try to understand why the anti-gender, and more specifically the concept, has so far met with a very few echoes in the field of social science on Africa, and particularly in French-speaking Africa. The difficulty is twofold, stemming from both academic and activist issues, as the interview, a recent interview of two of the well-known feminists, Fatou Sow and Rose Ndenge, illustrates. For African academics, and intellectual who claim to be feminist, for instance, the priority is to have a feminist accepted in scientific debates and the academic field. They have also participated in the development of African feminist epistemologies to analyze gender based on concepts in the development such as feminism, anti-feminism, and masculinity. They therefore question the relevance of introducing a new concept such as anti-gender to deal with phenomena that can be addressed by existing theoretical tools. The reversion toward anti-gender also stems from the mistrust of the term gender, which is too often associated with the term development and emptied of its critical substance. African feminist intellectuals see this as a neoliberal trick of depoliticizing feminism and gender in favor of empty slogans that are widely mediatized by the development industry. Nevertheless, nuances need to be established between Francophone and Anglophone Africa, for instance. In Francophone Africa, as I said before, anti-gender is, as a concept, is not used. But in Anglophone Africa, there are controversy, public controversy and discussion around anti-gender because the term is used, and you will understand why. The term is used based on the transnational link from Anglophone world, from the US to the Anglophone Africa, which is not the case with the French and the Francophone world to the Francophone Africa. Another hypothesis could be put forward regarding the lack of interest in the notion of anti-gender in the social sense in Africa. The study of conservative mobilization is largely underestimated in African social movement studies, despite the gradual emergence of a literature questioning the way in which the dominant contest. This is all the more pronounced in the field of African studies, where the sociology of movement was renewed later, and where the emphasis was mainly placed on the mobilization of the poor and the weak. Beyond the academic sphere, the reluctant use of the notion of anti-gender arose can be understood in the light of the history of feminism and feminist struggle in Africa. These struggles have led to significant progress, particularly in terms of the recognition of some of the civil political rights. But there are still strong obstacles when it comes to the private and intimate sphere. So fighting against anti-gender through a united pro-gender front, bringing together the feminist causes a threat, and run a risk of dispersing the struggle and therefore harming their effectiveness. So some feminists therefore choose to distinguish themselves from the struggle for protection of sexual minorities. And the sexual minorities, depending on the places, they stand alone. They try to work with feminists, but this is so far something very difficult on the continent. So in addition to the competition that may exist between these groups for international aid funds, some feminist group or figure prefer to keep their distance from mobilization in favor of sexual minorities, which because of their very strong social stigmatization could hinder any possibility of reform in favor of women. Thus, they are attacked by anti-gender activists tend to suggest that gender designates an ideology, a group, and a common struggle, thereby obscuring the plurality of struggle and the dynamics of alliance and division among the pro-gender movement in Africa. This is a very important pattern in the field which need to be acknowledged. This kind of impossible pro-gender front, which is starting to be the case elsewhere in the world, or which has been the case for decades elsewhere in the Western world, for instance. So does this mean that there's the lack of anti-gender also signify the lack of anti-gender practice in the field? And the answer is clearly no. While the concept of anti-gender appears little in the languages of actors from the conservative rank, the need to preserve value and traditions in the name of an African identity undermined by Western perversion is systematically found. By showing the African declension of anti-gender, it allows that to question the paradoxical effect of the concept, this concept, which contributes to the factor to the repoliticization of gender, a notion that has been largely demonized in the academic and the activist field in Africa, thus opening up new challenges and perspectives for feminists and LGBTI on the continent.
Second part, or do you want to go to the second part? Right.
While the concept of anti-gender appear little, if at all, in the language of actors that are from the conservative ranks, the need to preserve value and tradition in the name of African identity, undermined by Western perversion, is systematically found in almost every country. By showing the African declension of anti-gender, it allows us to question the paradoxical effects of this concept, which contributes to the factor to the repoliticization of gender, a notion that has been largely demonized in the academic and civil society activism in Africa, thus opening up a new challenges and perspective for LGBTQI and feminists on the continent. Kaoma Kapia, who is one of the most the well-known author on anti-gender in Africa, has demonstrated the important role of American conservative movement in spreading the fight against gender ideology. Kapia showed concretely how American Christian rights activists were trying to promote anti-gay and anti-feminist political agenda in Africa based on the strategies they used to create political network on the continent. He analyzed how major U.S. evangelical groups working in Africa initiated relationship with religious leaders on the continent. This direct intervention through mentoring has facilitated the transplantation of U.S. culture war, like he called it, into Uganda and other countries like Zambia, particularly around legislation to criminalize homosexuality. In the same perspective, Halle McQueen, for instance, show how American conservative have imported a form of moral panic to the continent, using the concept of coloniality, warning first on the visibility of sexual minorities and their legal recognition, but also on the spread of sex education and the gender confusion it would entail, or of the decline in the rate of marriage and birth, which would be attributable to the feminist and LGBTQI movement. She gave the example of organizations such as the World Congress of Family, which is very active in English-speaking Africa, particularly in South Africa, but also in Ghana and other parts of the continent. This reinforces the idea of divide between Anglophone and Francophone Africa. The more visible the struggle for the recognition of the sexual right, the stronger the opposition and the formation to anti-gender movement. These anti-gender initiatives by feminist groups, such as the Sex Education Project, launched in 2019 in South Africa, are the most big paradox of anti-gender in the continent. And you find example of like this one in Senegal, but also in other countries. The fact that you have a figure and movement identified as pro-gender who now counter the sexual minority on the continent. So beyond this North-South connection, the transnational dimension of anti-gender in Africa is also rooted in the network and relay that anti-gender movement can find in international arena, and particularly within the United Nations. The rise of anti-gender movement in this arena, which were originally occupied by progressive groups, reflect a form of backlash following the UN conferences that recognizes sexual and reproductive rights and gender mainstreaming. So when looking at the targets of nationalist discourses within gender theory, it is the gay and LGBTQI+ issues that comes to the fore. Pro-family activists argue, for example, that LGBTQI+ and feminist advocacy for more inclusive African society are projects driven by Western liberal elites seeking to import ideology and perversion from a decadent West to Africa. And they clearly make the link between gender and colonialization, stating that gender is colonialization and that they have the mission to prevent Africa from a recolonialization of gender. Now, allow me to say something about the strategies those anti-gender use in the continent, and therefore speak a little bit of give some few examples of what is going on in West and Central Africa. So among the most important strategy, you have the denunciation, then organizing public events, the misuse of the law, the formation of political alliance, anti-abortion action, and now very important digital activism, putting all this together in a kind of gender war, gender and sexual war 2.0. So about the denunciation, this is one of the most popular mode of communication in Africa. Denunciation makes many forms, the most classic of which is the use of print media and social network. The consequences of whistleblowing are considerable, both personally and collectively. While I was in the Central African Republic a month ago, 2 young men were expelled to neighboring Cameroon by a ministerial order for being accused of same-sex practice. In Cameroon, at the end of December 2018, in an open letter, a teachers' union formally spoke out against sex education in schools, arguing that Western decline should be avoided and the traditional value of Cameroonian society respected. In organizing public events, as one of the anti-gender strategy, you have various actors. For instance, in Ghana in 2019, with the World Congress of Family, which organizes the US-based International World Congress, the same year, a pro-life family, which preaches the protection of human life, held a session in Bangui and other African capitals, led by Archbishop and cardinals. They focus on the theme of life and family, bluntly condemning what is considered a threat to these values, namely terrorism, but also abortion and homosexuality. In Cameroon, several demonstrations against homosexuality took place in early 2000 in different cities. The most striking example was a public march by organized by the Cardinal of Douala at the time, with more than 50,000 people on the street, which is something the government will never authorize unless it's for the contestation of sexual minorities or abortion. I will also talk about the misuse of the law and then go to some concluding remark. This misuse of the law is expressed by the proposal of every kind of new bills penalizing same-sex relationship and any person or organization that defend them, by crafting and getting signature on petition addressed to the highest political authorities, by attacking training content in school. In Ghana, for instance, 8 members of parliament, including 7 from the opposition, submitted an anti-gay bill to parliament in July 2021. In Senegal, at the end of December 2020, and in an open letter, a teachers' union formally declared itself against sex education, also in school. So this follow also the political alliance that we that I talked about earlier. So now let me conclude, please, on all this. So anti-gender mobilization in Africa appear to be a very important analyzer of the ongoing process of expressing nationalism and conservatism and also construction of patriotism. As many studies have shown, the historical link between nationalism and issues of gender and sexuality, even in Africa, which can be summarized by the term of sexual nationalism, is a very important reality. So one of the patterns in the continent is that the use of anti-gender as a concept is not generalized, but the practice, the actions against gender, the practice, the actions against feminism, practice actions against sexual orientation and gender identity, actions against sexual and reproductive health are present everywhere and almost every day. There's no country in the continent where you can every morning take one newspaper and not find something related to LGBTI controversy, trans people controversy, sexual and gender orientation controversy. So the issue is, how do we deal with something which is not clearly conceptualized, and how do we deal with activists who are not always organized and whose targets are not always clear and openly expressed. Thank you for your attention.
Oops. Oh, I don't, is this working? Yes. Okay, our discussant for this session is Leah Feldman from the University of Chicago, who's a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the college, and who works on translation and the Caucasus and Central Asia, and has written a book on the threshold of Eurasia, Orientalism and Revolutionary Aesthetics, and that is a prize-winning book. So I'm not going to go on about her CV, but you have it access to you, sent to you. Here she is.
Thanks so much, and thank you for bringing me in as a discussant. It's been such a pleasure to spend the day listening to these exciting papers. I started working on the right about, maybe 5 years ago, and when I was writing on Soviet Orientalism for my book, and I started teaching courses on the new right, and was working on a special issue, and so which will be coming out in this winter. So I spent a lot of time thinking about some of these issues, but really not spend a lot of time thinking about and specifically the question of gender as it's mobilized. So I think this conference is really timely, and much more work needs to be done in this field. I think it's really crucial. So thank you. I just have some very, very brief notes here in general, and then just some questions along those lines, and that we might continue to think about through all of these fascinating papers. I think one of the major themes that's come together today for me is the ways in which the right's anti-gender campaigns are part of a global movement, an interconnected global movement that is deeply invested in forms of neoliberal politics, as well as its anti-globalist orientation. It's anti-globalist ideological orientation. And I think that's the crux of a lot of, behind a lot of the elements in new right discourses. On the one hand, it's really virulent anti-globalism. And on the other, it's deep investment in structures of neoliberal governance and securitization. I think a few points are kind of come to the fore in relationship to these structures of power that animate the right. One is the attack on knowledge systems. And this has come to the fore in many of the papers today, as well as Professor Ropes' fascinating keynote. That is the formation of a body of knowledge that the right is assembling to counter what it sees as the globalized liberal elite and the ways in which the university as its primary institution has served to propagandize those ideologies. This is what the right thinks of. And so they're really invested in kind of forming their own alternative knowledge system through attacks on the university, through attacks on gender theory, on queer theory, through attacks on critical race studies, which hasn't been as much at the fore of this conversation, but I hope will continue to be. Secondly, an attack on the right's attack on international political structures, and this has come to the fore through discussions of the threat of the UN, the EU, attacks on globalization through aid work, NGOs, and through the reimagination of human rights discourses, of course, which is really crucial. As well as these international conferences, right, that brought to the fore this threat for the right, and their own kind of counter mobilization of their own internationalist networks, their own internationalist conferences, their own publishing houses, and so forth. And then the last aspect, which is related to this, is their attack or their attempt to create a new political semiotics. And this really is also relates to the ways in which they kind of invent this notion of an organic politics, right? Or this discourse of nature, which is, of course, indebted to romantic 19th century romanticism and its visions of wholeness and totality, right? As well as defense of the family, human right, and like the family and traditional values, or what I call trad rights, right? This overlap between this notion of human rights discourses and traditionalist values, right? Conceived as in this kind of organic and indeed, like many of the resonances share this language of ecological preservation, like this sort of eco-fascist narratives. So this organic, natural vision of organic or natural discourses of the rights politics also foreground notion of pollution, right? The pollution of the other, the pollution of immigration, and serve to sustain, again, the rights, white supremacist discourses. So along these lines, I found Professor Borba's paper really fascinating investigation of the kind of process of creation of this alternative political semiotics. And I'd be curious to hear more too to this end, to what extent your analysis, which is really kind of expansive and looks at quite a broad range of media, to what extent that is also takes as its aims the university directly. To what extent is the university or academic discourse central to that, to within that archive, or kind of like targeted within that archive? I'm also curious to that extent if there's any emphasis on free speech. And I'm thinking of the ways in which the right has mobilized the free speech narrative as a kind of, again, alternative, part of their efforts to create a kind of alternative political semiotics and engage with rights discourse in that sense. And I think, I don't think that Professor Owando is with us right now. I'm not sure, but I think, you know, it would be great to continue this discussion of this fascinating paper and the ways in which there's a kind of resonance of a sort of anti-colonial nationalist discourse. And I think earlier, Professor Graf took this up in terms of the case of Eastern Europe as well, like the ways in which anti-colonial discourse is perverted to imagine a kind of nationalist critique of sort of this again, this vision of the globalized Western hegemony. And Professor Case, I think this this video, Zelensky's parody of Kazakhstan, the boy band group from the 2010s, certainly is. I think one of the things that you raise here that's really interesting is what you called this kind of elements of traditional Ukrainian culture, which are, of course, also the kind of creation of we're part of the Soviet creation of a kind of idea of what Ukrainian culture was in the early 20th century, and I think the video is really interesting. I think, as you point out, in its critique of Russia vis-a-vis this kind of imposed Orientalist vision of what Ukraine is. What I would then ask is, if the crux of that parody falls on a use of cross-dressing, is this really a redemptive reading of Portrait of Gender here that's being mobilized, and to what extent this is just relying on a common trope of white men dressing up as women as a point of humor, though certainly the video, I think, is interesting in its critique of this Orientalist construction of what an idea of Ukraine is. But I'd like to hear more about the role that this cross-dressing plays for you in this video. And then I'll just end with these kind of 2 points that I think we could continue to explore today. One is to return to this, the critique of the university, the critique of critical race theory and gender theory. What is the role of the university here? What is the role of the university that we're inhabiting right now? You know, how has the corporatization of the university system played a role in the critique of critical humanities and the diminished platform and possibility for teaching critical humanities? And how can we think about this, the relationship between that development and the development of the right's political semiotics, right? So how do we think about our role within this system in the creation of that alternative semiotic discourse? And the other question related to that is about the kind of longer history of the right dating back to 1968. And in what ways can we kind of extend this really fascinating genealogy that Professor Ropes has provided for us in terms of thinking about the influence of gender theory and Butler's work in the 90s, and the ways in which that might trace back to an earlier moment in 1968 and a reaction in the construction of the new right against this moment of post-structuralist theory. in 68, and in particular, the reaction to independence movements across the decolonizing world in this moment at the same time. And the second point is the role of white supremacy. What's the role of white supremacy here, and how is it inextricable from this question of gender? How can we see this implicitly within this question of the role of the natural or the traditional kind of politics that's being invoked here? And how does it inform the ways in which we see performances of gender here? Of course, like this sort of homoerotic elements of cross-dressing and elements of this kind of gender performance was used in Nazi Germany as well, but only and particularly by white men. So how do we think through the ways in which race plays a crucial role in the ways in which we see gender being performed in this moment? That's all.
You want to respond?
I'm just testing if this is okay. Sorry.
No, I'm just going to say respond, please, both of you, either way, and then we can open it up to the audience.
Yeah, fine. And thank you, Leo, for the comments. I think you touched upon a very central aspect of anti-genderism, which Agnieszka has already written about that, which is a construction of this alternative field of knowledge. And to my view, that happens, and in my data, it seems to show it happens in two interconnected ways. First, because somehow now the notion of the idea of gender that has become popular, that the common population knows, is the anti-gender view of gender. It's not our view of gender. So their alternative knowledge system has become dominant in a certain way. And that only happened because that production of an alternative knowledge system wasn't really based on a complete disruption from the available systems already. And Professor Gall has written about it in reference to Hungary. Like anti-genderists, they piggyback on concepts that already have some authority, institutional authority, and that people have heard of. Maybe they are not aware of what they actually mean. But the vocabulary is available. They don't invent new words. Even in terms of gender ideology, people know what gender is. They have an idea of what gender is, and they know what the ideology is. So that's the appeal of it. Now, in my data, that mentions to university, and that is a very hot topic in Brazil since Bolsonaro took over office, because he has a very strong position against public universities in Brazil. That we get free public universities funded by the government. So his supporters, most of them, or maybe all of them, are anti-genderists. They take very clear positions against public universities. So I haven't actually looked at that point at the data, but it overlaps, like anti-intellectualism overlaps with anti-genderism very significantly. But in my corpus, I would have to look at it more specifically. That's a very good question, actually. When I get back to the hotel, I'll look at the universities, just to see how statistically it appears in the data. But it does appear, as I scanned some of the articles, it is frequent comments against what the professors and researchers are doing at the secrecy of the classroom, indoctrinating children and things like that. But what is most conspicuous in the data is regular education, schools, not universities. They are very much worried about what teachers are doing in the classroom, indoctrinating children. So that's very common. Now, free speech in the data doesn't really appear. However, it became, I don't have data for that, but it became very popular for the Brazilian extreme right during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, because of the vaccination scheme, so anti-genderists also started criticizing the vaccination scheme in Brazil. So there was this movement which also piggybacks on legitimate discourses of trans-vaccinated. You had that in the US too, of course. Brazilians always import things from the US. So there was this strong trans-vaccinated movement, which were people who said that they believed they were vaccinated, so they didn't need to actually get vaccinated. So like co-opting the discourse of transgender identification. So if you say you are a woman, you are a woman. If you say you are vaccinated, you are vaccinated. You don't need to get vaccinated. And they pitch that on the notion of free speech also. So that's quite recent, actually. So that's something that we need to take more data to take a look into. It's a very, very, very interesting and important questions.
Okay, so first let me thank the commentator, and I also wanted to shout out to my RA, Malavika Paraswati, who is the one who put the video together, and so I would take issue with the notion that the video is cross-dressing. I absolutely concede that the clip from Servant of the People is cross-dressing and fits into exactly the familiar tropes you mentioned. We talked at lunch a bit about the panto dame. The babushka in that is basically the panto dame. But if I come back to the video, and I defer to someone who knows Eastern Europe to tell me that in Eastern Europe things are not true. Let me first start with one of the things I have studied is that what is gendered masculine or feminine can vary widely across cultures and time periods. Famously, pink and blue are creatures of the mid-20th century. And before that, the argument was, well, pink is a hot, vibrant, intense color, more suitable to boys. And since the Middle Ages, girls were seen as cold and wet, like water, like blue, right? So there are things that are traditionally in almost every society gendered masculine or feminine, and the military masculinity is a great example of that. But one other thing that I'm doing with the old-fashioned show and tell is I'm wearing dukash. If you know Ukrainian, you know culture, you know that this is a classic woman's piece of clothing. If you don't, you think she's wearing a military medal around her neck. I am wearing a jacket, which to an American audience in the 21st century reads feminine. And if a man were to wear it, it would be a gay man or maybe a Black man who is particularly dandyish. In the 18th century, this is what a man would wear. This is exactly what a man would wear, a brocaded jacket of this shape. In the video, there are two kinds of clothing worn. There's the traditional Cossack clothing. If you don't know from Cossacks and you see a bunch of men in embroidered flowered shirts and flouncy pants, you think they're the cross-dressing ones, not they're the macho ones. When they strip and wear exactly what the boy band wore, yes, they're wearing high heels. Now, again, in the 18th century, so would men. They're wearing bondage gear, which does whatever else it codes as, doesn't code as feminine or as cross-dressing. And they're wearing, they're wearing all black. They're wearing tight, pants and flouncy shirts that, flamenco dancers wear, male flamenco dancers. So I agree that they are playing with gender and playing with implications of homosexuality and other non-traditional sexual practices. I mean, you can wear bondage gear in a hetero, homo, or much more complicated scenario, right? But I don't think that they are cross-dressing in the other sorts of ways. And again, this is where my knowledge of the culture is woefully limited. But I'll take the risk of taking on this issue of whiteness in the context of the Ukrainians. And the thing about Cossacks is there's a whole lot of boundary and categorization questions. Cossacks, are they good or bad? Cossacks, are they Ukrainian or Russian? And of course, the answer is in both cases, both and, right? Cossacks, are they white? And as compared to what? I mean, they're the people who are carrying out the pogroms. So if you're Jewish, and I know a lot of blonde, blue-eyed American descendants of Eastern European Jews who say, we're not white, Jews aren't white. So vis-a-vis the Jews in the pogroms, clearly the Cossacks are white. But my understanding, and I defer again to the experts in Eastern Europe, is that they are not simply and classically white in the context of the, I'll use the term with no pun intended, white Russians.
Are you talking about Cossacks?
Yeah.
Complicated.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. It is complicated.
But okay.
I mean, if you can uncomplicate it for me, no, great. But my point is that it's complicated.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions, or Misha, are there questions from the okay, so maybe what we should do is take one question or comment from the online audience, and then we'll come back if anyone here has a comment or question, and I will think about your question.
Do you want to do the online first? I think I had some of those. We're having technology problems. I want to read it online, and I'll get this back here.
Okay, so a participant on Zoom is asking, if we understand anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ politics as a result of a collusion globally between the nationalist conservative right on one side and resistance to Western neoliberal values on the other side, what are hints to strategies and approaches for the feminist and queer activists and organizers from the countries of the global majority? We keep circling around activism, so yeah, this is just another question.
I'm not sure if I understood the question, sorry.
What can be done?
What can be done? Oh, okay. So,
maybe just to repeat the last sentence, what are the strategies and approaches for feminist and queer activists and organizers from the countries of global majority?
Okay, what can be done? Well, I think one thing that can be done is to use their own modes of action and language to counter what they do. So we just use the same strategies, but of course with more seriousness. And this is one thing that I've been doing with Sonia Correa, the feminist who has been mentioned. We are working on a project in which we are producing a kind of counter lexicon to the Vatican's lexicon. So we are writing entries to this dictionary based on the Brazilian extreme right vocabulary and explaining to a general public how the extreme right manipulates those words to mean what they mean and what are the effects, the political effects of that. Mm-hmm. And so it's a bunch of applied linguists and translators. So one version of this dictionary is for undergrads, so that can be circulated, and the other version is the translation of the same dictionary into simpler Portuguese to high schoolers. So this is something that we basically use the same strategies that they use, and that came, and the idea of producing that dictionary with Sonia Correa, who is an activist, actually came after we read Susan Gall's work, recent work on drafting and clasping and relaying. Sonia finds those concepts very, very useful, and so of course do I. So we started inspired by that, by Gall's discussion of Hungary and the gender politics there. We decided to produce these dictionaries, which then are but they are online, completely free. And then we are now, our next step is to liaise with teachers and activists to work on workshops on how those dictionaries, that material, can be used to circulate an alternative system of knowledge to the anti-genderists and to far right. So this is something that could be done and could be effective.
So what I have been saying now for about a dozen years is that we should be who they think we are, right? They think we are, I mean, what I've said is, they think we have the same approach toward human nature as logging companies have toward the rainforests, clear cutting through human nature. They also think we're united and powerful. I think there should be less siloization, whether you think of silos as guarding resources, or you think of silos as defensive for weaponry. I think we need to recapture a notion of the term ally, that at least to get to the linguistics of it, that in the United States has disappeared. An ally used to be someone with common interests who was making common cause with you, not out of altruistic, other regarding support, but out of the, to serve, to see where the interests intersected and what could be done to advance everyone's interests together. So I am really linguistically fed up with the idea that an ally is a white person who supports Black people, a straight person who supports, or if it is a white person, or to get back to gender, if it is a man who supports women's rights or a straight person who supports queer rights, it is because they themselves, as men, as straight, are advantaged by a world in which these rights have more traction. And I think one way of making that, I think we're seeing this not unfortunately soon enough or strongly enough to influence what I fear will happen in a couple of weeks in the November elections. I think we're seeing with respect to abortion that a whole lot of people who idly were willing to vote conservative and idly also rhetorically to endorse the conservative anti-gender agenda really don't want to live with it themselves. Whether that's very traditional family values, whether that's an end to the new reproductive technologies, including contraception, conception, and abortion. We saw that in Poland, right? When did the Poland, I mean, I wish Agnieszka, I think Agnieszka is no longer with us because of the time it is in her, in Poland, but, it's when abortion, when the Polish government did what it always said it wanted to, and what the Catholics initially endorsed with respect to abortion, that finally the women rose up.
I think that what you said about allyship also taps into what you mentioned about the role of the university. What can universities do? Mm. That's one thing that we could do, like that. What Sonia and I are doing, it's a bunch of academic linguists writing to a general public, which is extremely difficult to do. So I found out that I don't know how to write to undergrads, and I feel very guilty about it. So we developed this system in which everyone writes their entries, and the entries are rewritten by everyone in the team, and it's rewritten, like every entry was rewritten like 10 times until we get to the right tone. We don't know how to talk to these people, to people outside of the university. That's the reality. So this kind of alliances are extremely important for us to leave our silos also.
I would add even the word coalition building, because this is such an important coalition building. I mean, it was used by Black feminists in the 70s to think through the problem of how to relate to, and how to organize with white feminists in this moment. So I think this is still really important to return to this literature from the 70s already about coalition.
Should I go? Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much to both of the papers presentators. So for Rodrigo, I thought that was really fascinating. I mean, obviously, I think the language here is extremely important. And I guess I wanted to ask you about your time frame here. I think you said 2017 to 2020. I was wondering if this was because this is when the moment of anti-genderism kind of explodes in Brazil. And so if so, I think, if anything, your presentation also has convinced me that it's really hard to come up with one overall argument for all of these different, I mean, as much as we can, and for all of these different movements. So there are, there's a link, I think, here to populism. There's obviously a link to education here that you talked about, the kind of anti-elitism that we see, but then they don't have, it seems like, for example, the kind of white nationalist subtext that we see in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe is kind of missing in Latin, at least in Brazil, and I think in Colombia and Mexico too. So I'd be kind of curious to, so I guess my question is also like, how do you explain this kind of explosion of anti-genderism during those years in Brazil? Like, what is the kind of, I mean, I know it's a huge question, but what are the kinds of more salient issues that you see bringing this to the front, even before the election of Bolsonaro? I mean, I imagine it has to do with kind of the so-called corruption of the Socialist Party, all of these things that, or the rise of evangelicalism. So kind of those, I'd love to hear you say more about this. And so, you know, if there was a way to trace this empirically, that would be so fascinating to see like what kind of issues they get attached to, because I think what I was trying to explain earlier in the keynote was not like that it's you know, like abortion and LGBT rights feature prominently in the 1990s, and then we talked about this that like later it becomes much more about trans rights and all this stuff. So what other issues are kind of like bracketed under this? And then Marianne, just quickly. So I think all of the images are fantastic, and there's like, I feel like we could have like an hour discussion about all of these. And just one comment, the American Army video is also insane. And I think the fact that they can produce this after, you know, 30 years after Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I mean, it's an argument for homo nationalism and the kind of alliance between militarism and gay rights, which is also has a lot of scary things to say about the moment we're in. But I guess I'm not sure. Two questions. The Zelensky, did you see any kind of how anti-Semitism intersected in any of these videos, for example, because of, you know, if there was any anti-genderism and anti-Semitism kind of coinciding in around his figure? And then I would love if you could sort of, I guess I could see how the Russians are using the Zelensky videos or how you could see this to reinforce a kind of Russian idea of masculinity or a Trumpist idea of American masculinity. But I guess I wasn't quite sure about what your argument was about Zelensky himself. Like, how is he using the gender, this gender fluidity, basically? Like, I can't make it out exactly. Like, I can't figure out what exactly, how I don't know how to read this, basically. Because it is very confusing in many ways. Like, I think the fact that he can use these tropes in such different ways.
Can we answer first? I'll forget, there's so many complications here. So on the anti-Semitism, I have never known what to make of the pig. And the Gogol story is about Christmas. Now, there's no Christ in Christmas in the Gogol story. I mean, I'll defer again to the Gogol expert on the panel, but I don't see any Christ. There are witches and there are magicians, but there's no Christ. And of course, famously, Soviet Jews celebrated New Year's with a Christmas, what we would call a Christmas tree, and they call it a New Year's tree. So as we were discussing over lunch, including a pig says, I'm not Jewish, right? It says, I mean, it may not say I'm deeply and devoutly Christian, but it certainly says I am not deeply and devoutly Jewish. I don't keep kosher. And I have no idea, you know, what the pig is. And that means that there's a whole lot of things about the video that go so far over my head that I am being presumptuous by saying what the bottom line is. But for me, and one of the reasons I see the bottom line I do is because I have looked for and found it in a whole lot of other contexts I do feel qualified to opine on that are American or that are Western European. And what I see them saying is basically, you know, if you're secure in your masculinity, then all of these trappings don't matter and all of the accusations don't matter. We can take them on board and not be threatened. The person who has to posture and always look masculine, never look a hint of feminine, is someone who is insecure in his masculinity. So this is the difference between Putin and Trump on the one hand and Zelensky on the other. And I think the message that the video is intended to send in its time to the audience, whether that's the audience of the Russians who were Zelensky's first fans. I mean, he started the troop in Russia and left, again, people who know better can correct me, but what I have been given to understand is the troop was in Russia, working in Russia in Russian, and then the people who were financing it said, we want you, Zelensky. You're the person who's doing all the good stuff. Dump the rest of these people and we'll give you a big contract. And Zelensky said, no, thanks, I'm sticking with my people. And he went back to Ukraine and started moving into Ukrainian, and the rest is history, as they say. But I take him also to be saying to all of the audiences, especially the audiences in Ukraine and in Russia, but potentially, so I don't think anybody outside of Ukraine and Russia watched this thing because it is in Ukrainian. That's fine. If you say we should be upset that we're turning to the Europe of Conchita Wurst, the Europe of all of the things you say we should be scared of. No. A, we're not scared, and B, we don't have to make it a 180-degree turn. We can bring out again the new as well as the old. We can keep our identity. And this gets to what I was interested in hearing more from Agnieszka about, right? It's not colonization if you voluntarily choose, and it's not threat if you say, I can keep what I have even as I join you, even as I turn. And again, this is what Putin says the Ukrainians cannot do. Putin says Ukraine cannot exist. And the video says Ukraine can exist, and a turn toward Europe is what makes it possible for it to exist, to keep all that is traditionally, stereotypically, whatever adjective you want to use, Ukrainian. The way to go is to turn toward Europe, not to turn toward Russia.
But they're not meant to be heroes. We're supposed to laugh at them. And we're supposed to laugh at the fact that they look gay, that they look feminine, that they look weak.
So, may I say something to that? Yeah. I think that the story that you have, Marianne, is a very interesting one. Mm-hmm. And speaking as an anthropologist, the next step is to see if that was in fact the reaction. Yeah. Right. So, and because we have the internet, people are constantly reacting to every single thing that's on there and in huge quantities. And one of the problems that anthropologists have is how can they deal with the amounts of data that we have about reactions? So I really think that your research assistants, your stuff, I think the next step is to find out how people in Ukraine and in Russia, because they have access, right, responded to this. And my guess would be that there were many different kinds of response, possibly all the one that you're saying, but possibly also actually the one that Leah is saying. That would be a really interesting thing to figure out.
So first of all,
and one more thing, that these kinds of reactions are very time specific. Mm-hmm. So that you have a context in which people are reacting to a video, including the American one, which was a real freak out for me. And it would be really fascinating to see exactly what was reacted to at that time and then to see other times.
So this is a call to anybody within earshot or anybody who knows anybody. I haven't even been able to get someone who Ukrainian is good enough to tell me what the actual text of the video said. There's no subtitles, there's no translation. I would need someone I have no way of identifying to do exactly the work that you are suggesting. And I agree that the readings can be multiple, just like, again, I showed you the American reaction to the Choose Your Fighter, right? 180 degrees different, all Americans, maybe not all Americans, but all Twitter users. And again, I welcome correction. I don't know. My sense is that the audience for Zelensky is a pro-Europe audience, is an audience that's not, that as a percent, if you chart them on average on the homophobia chart of Ukraine, they're on the not particularly homophobic end. If you chart them on the anti-gender end or the threatened by gender bending model, they're going to be they're going to be more on that end than the other end, and maybe not even in the middle. I could be totally wrong about that. This is part of the problem of taking the risk of thinking you see things you have seen before in contexts you know, in a context you really cannot begin to understand because it is so foreign in every sense of the word.
So can I just reply to her question? Sorry. So thanks, Camille. So the first part of her question about the time cutoff. So as we are comparing two corpora, they need to be similar, both in qualitative terms and also in quantitative terms. So gender ideology started circulating in Brazil in 2003, very early on, but it really picked up public attention at around 2011, 2013, it became extremely popular. In the US, however, its entry into the US was very, very late, about 2015, 2016. So so much so that if we compare the occurrences of gender ideology in the US corpus and in the Brazilian corpus, it's very discrepant. It appears 116 times in the US corpus, and in the Brazilian corpus, like hundreds and hundreds of times. So much so that Angela and I were able to investigate all the 116 appearances of gender ideology in the US corpus, but it was impossible to do that in the Brazilian corpus because it was too much. But I also have another corpus of speeches at the lower house, and that's where I found the first mention of gender ideology in 2003. And if you keep tracking the uses of ideologia de gênero in deputies' speeches, you can find how they start to overlap with other themes and other concerns of the evangelicals, of the Catholics, of far-right politicians. And I suspect, I haven't looked at that very, very deeply, but I suspect that the eruption of ideologia de gênero also overlapped with Dilma's government. So there was like huge dissatisfaction of the patriarchal right with a woman as a president. And not only a woman that was not, to their view, feminine and submissive, a woman that actually confronted them. So, and Bolsonaro was actually the one who made it very popular. First in 2011, when he became very, very public about a anti-homophobic project that Dilma was preparing to fight homophobia at schools, something that Bolsonaro started calling the gay kit. So, and telling the public that kids would be taught how to be gays. And his positions about that were so boisterous and so noisy that Dilma came on public television saying that she wouldn't be promoting homosexuality, and that the whole project and the material that was ready and cost millions of reais was canceled. So no one actually saw the material, but the gay kit, it still hovers over like a ghost, and they keep mentioning it. So there is lots of overlaps, and I suspect that it started becoming popular because of a female as a president of the country.
Mm-hmm. So, oh, you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So you said that you don't have a full understanding of the context of Russia and Ukraine, so I'm going to ask you a few more questions about it, if you don't mind. The first one, quickly, is I was confused as to why the Russian propaganda was depicting Poroshenko in such a denigrating way, or at least in that like sort of masculinist framework, a denigrating way, because I thought that he was the sort of the Putin-backed, Russian-backed leader, and that it was his overthrow that triggered the invasion of Crimea and everything that we're still dealing with. And second is, Putin has framed this invasion of Russia as denazification, which is obviously not what's actually happening. I was curious if you have seen any evidence of the anti-genderism in Russia specifically also having a strong anti-Semitic strain, considering how strong anti-Semitism is in Russia, and if that produces any contradictions with with the idea that they're supposedly denazifying Russia, or denazifying Ukraine, when they're also generating these anti-Jewish conspiracy theories?
So I was a little distracted from your second question by your first question, because I think you've got it backwards. Poroshenko was the one who took over after Euromaidan, not the one who left. He became president on May 25th, 2014, and stayed president, and was responsible for, in 2018, for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine separating from Moscow. So I think you just mixed up the names. I mean, as my students will tell you, I've been terrible at names. It has nothing to do with old age or anything. I'm just terrible at names. I mean, even if their names, less foreign to me than Poroshenko, but I'm confident that Poroshenko is.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I'm going to cut this off because I think you two should talk afterwards. We're really low on time at this point, and in order to assure that we all have a little bit of break between sessions and still have time for our last session, I think we should thank the speakers and the discussion, and take the break.